Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence makes his first stop in Japan on his way to the Winter Olympic Games in South Korea. Could he calm the nerves of American allies in Asia against the perceived DPRK nuclear threat? On the sideline of last month's World Economic Forum, former Nigerian Finance Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala minces no words in sizing up the Nigerian economy and in pushing for immunization against the deadly diseases in the developing world. Let's begin our show today in Japan, where U.S. Vice President Mike Pence met with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe before leading the U.S. delegation to the Winter Olympics in South Korea. The visit comes amidst the U.S. efforts to reassure American allies against the growing nuclear threat from the DPRK, with visits to Japan and South Korea. Although the Trump administration has abandoned Obama's so-called pivot to Asia policy, does Pence's Asia tour mean anything to the White House now when it comes to its strategy toward Asia? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
During the meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Pence said Washington stood shoulder to shoulder with Japan in achieving the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
On behalf of President Trump, the United States is with you in this challenge, and we will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Japan, the people of South Korea, and our allies and partners across the region until we achieve the global objective of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and we end the provocations and threats that North Korea has presented to this region and to the wider world.
Japan is only the beginning of Pence's Asia tour. He took part in a briefing on missile defense with the Japanese Minister of Defense Itsunori Onodera and observed a demonstration of military equipment, including a PAC-3 missile. The U.S. Vice President said his visit to the region was aimed at ratcheting up pressure on the DPRK over its nuclear program. Pyongyang test-fired ballistic missiles over Japan last year and launched a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile that climbed to an altitude of more than 4,000 kilometers before splashing into the sea within Japan's exclusive economic zone. On Thursday, Mr. Pence will head to South Korea, where he will meet with South Korean President Moon Jae-in and attend the opening of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics Friday night. At the Games, Pence is not expected to meet with members of the DPRK delegation. Still, the U.S. hasn't ruled out the possibility of talks.
For more on Mike Pence's visit to Japan, we are joining in our Beijing studio Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
In Hong Kong, we have Mr. Huang Zhengyu, former White House fellow. Welcome as well. And last but certainly not least, in Washington, D.C., Joel Rubin, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. I want to begin with you, Mr. Rubin, about Vice President Pence's visit to Japan. So he said many things, and then the White House said, don't take too seriously about what he said. And he said, contradicting words also at the same time, for example, toward the DPRK. So should we take any message from him, or should we not read anything from him, no matter what he said?
Well, this comes to the core question of what the White House's position is on Asia more broadly, and of course on the DPRK, and the incoherence is stunning still a year into the administration. Secretary of State Tillerson is consistently arguing for a diplomatic channel, hinting at a behind-the-scenes channel with the North Koreans. Vice President Pence says this, then he talks about extreme sanctions. We really don't know, quite frankly, nor do we have a clear sense of the vision that the administration has towards Asia. And when that is the case, that means essentially that we're going to be pulled by events on the ground. And right now the events on the ground are that South Korea and North Korea are beginning to engage each other through this period and this Olympics period. And for the United States, we're going to have to figure out how we respond to it in this reality. Right now, we haven't yet absorbed that South Korea and North Korea truly are beginning to talk.
Okay. that's understandable, as you haven't figured out exactly what the relationship and the chemistry would be like between the two Koreas, not to mention the other players. But at this point, we understand, Mr. Huang, that whenever the American officials is going through Japan, usually harsher words are being announced toward, let's just say, DPRK, and also toward the U.S. stance against some of the other countries, including toward China. But when it goes to South Korea, it could be a different picture. Are we seeing yesterday once more?
Well, you could argue that there's a level of inconsistency at the White House with the U.S. administration. However, I think there's another possibility, which is a good cop, bad cop combination. The U.S. will be the bad cop with tougher economic sanctions and potential military strike. And South Korea, potentially the good cop, starting a beachhead with North Korea in negotiations. So in that instance, they might be working closer together than we imagine.
Mr. Gao here in Beijing, of course, China is watching the situation very closely. It hopes there will be a very peaceful and also even friendly, warm atmosphere during the Olympic Games. But what's going to happen next? China do not have an idea. At this point, how do you read, as a Chinese scholar, the words coming from the Vice President passing through Japan?
First of all, we hope the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics will be a peaceful Olympics and will create an opportunity not only for the North Korea and South Korea to talk, but also enable countries like the United States and China and others to engage in meaningful discussions. As far as Vice President Pence's visit to Japan, of course, they need to make some utterances which may not be welcomed by China or by several other countries in this part of the world, but we need to listen to what they have to say and also watch very closely as to what the United States is really up to in the coming weeks and coming months.
Let's listen to what they have to say. According to Vice President Pence, Mr. Rubin, that there's going to be the toughest and the most aggressive economic sanctions against North Korea soon, quote unquote. So before the Winter Olympic Games, this is going to, in a way, pressure DPRK enough so that the other party wouldn't, in a way, go the other way around, or this is going to push the DPRK towards some kinds of reactions which would in turn harm the overall atmosphere? That is always the question, isn't it?
Well, there are two levels to analyze this. On the substantive level, the question of the most extreme sanctions ever, we've heard that many times before. Each time a new sanctions bill gets through the Congress, for example, on North Korea, it's described as the most aggressive sanctions ever. So let's wait and see on that. But in terms of the politics of this, this is reflective of a pattern where every so often aggressive language is used by the United States that mirrors aggressive language from North Korea, but it doesn't necessarily help the situation. Recently we had a debate here in Washington about whether or not the administration would be giving a bloody nose to North Korea, and that led to the determination of the ambassadorial nominee to South Korea, Victor Gao. He didn't want to be a part of that. Earlier we had fire and fury. These rhetorical flourishes seem to come at windows just when there are potential calming of nerves, and it really does make for a very unclear path in terms of how to engage in diplomacy.
Well, on the other hand, we also understand that there is something like the messages you deliver to your own country and the messages you deliver to your rival or possible even partner. So we heard different words coming from Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence also has been labeled as Trump's interpreter-in-chief. He did not rule out speaking with DPRK officials during the Winter Olympic Games. Listen to what he had to say to the media very closely.
With regard to any interaction with the North Korean delegation, I have not requested a meeting, but we'll see what happens.
Are you
Trump
saying that if an opportunity presented itself, sir, that you might avail yourself to at least greet any North Korean official that's there? And
well, let me say President Trump has said he always believes in talking. But I haven't requested any meeting, but we'll see what happens. But my message, whatever the setting, whoever's present, will be the same. and that is that North Korea must, once and for all, abandon its nuclear weapons program and ballistic missile ambitions.
We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, and we'll see what happens. That seems to be the phrase that's been repeatedly used by the Vice President of the United States, Mr. Huang. We'll see what happens. That seems to have, different layers of meanings. One is the United States is willing to cater to the circumstances change. However, it could also indicate that the United States has not decided at all about any strategy. Meanwhile, it could also mean the United States would never mind about exactly what's going on, continue with what they believe as the most important thing. Mr. Huang, what is your interpretation?
Yeah, so my interpretation is slightly different, because the script we're seeing today from North Korea is not new. Right, we've seen this before.
Yes.
North Korea demonstrates belligerence, showcases its military and nuclear capabilities, and then reconciles, gets some sort of appeasement through either military or economic aid, and this process repeats itself. So this script is not new. And I think what Trump has been trying to do is to put the military option on the table as something real. And what I see, what might be going on, again, to the point of we don't really know, but what I see might be going on is this good cop, bad cop option. Imagine you're in the middle room, this bad cop comes in, and he yells and screams and makes threat at you. And then he leaves. And then this good cop comes in and goes, you know what, that guy's crazy. I'm going to talk to him. And then he comes back and says, you know what, I think I could calm him down, only if you do the following things.
Right.
Now, if you really believe that the bad cop is crazy, then that good cop, bad cop combination might work. So I think that might be a ploy that's being used.
All right.
But who knows?
That's quite a tongue twister, by the way, Mr. Huang. Having said that, though, as the Vice President was talking, there could be different levels of interactions between the American and also the North Korean side. Whether vis-a-vis somebody else or directly even, we couldn't tell at this point. So, Mr. Gao, what would be the case? As we know in the delegation, Kim Jong-nam is going to lead the delegation. That's supposed to be the highest level if you look at the title of North Korean officials going to South Korea for a long, long time, for 60 years almost. And meanwhile, the sister of Mr. Kim Jong-un will also be in the Korea delegation to South Korea. So a lot of interesting possibilities over there, Mr. Gao.
Well, I personally do hope that the U.S. side and the DPRK side will have a chance to meet face-to-face in South Korea during the Pyeongchang Olympic Games. And this hopefully will pave the way for more substantive and in-depth discussions between the United States and DPRK for the ultimate goal of denuclearization. DPRK has maintained again and again that denuclearization is not an option to be discussed at all, but I hope they will come to their senses eventually, and creating an opportunity for DPRK and the United States to talk directly is definitely helpful and constructive. And I hope Vice President Pence will not let this rare opportunity go by. Seize the moment and seize the opportunity. This will be good for peace on the Korean Peninsula.
All right, Mr. Joel, Mr. Joel Rubin, would you know that whether in any way in the American delegation there are experts and people in the know who know about the Korean situation well and who are trustworthy, that would provide the right expertise to the Vice President when this opportunity really arises?
Well, there certainly are experts. There are career people, and there are people at the White House who were brought in who understand these dynamics in the history. But I'd like to think about what the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said about President Trump during the budget negotiations recently. He said it was like negotiating with Jell-O. And that's not a compliment when it comes to negotiation. I fear it's not a good cop, bad cop routine. I fear that it's a situation where they don't really know where they want to go. The instincts are all over the place. And as a result, the Vice President is left straddling between an unknown president vision and a Secretary of State who's trying to apply himself and get things done, and experts who are saying that the United States needs to really engage. And as a result, we may just end up seeing a flat line of engagement and a continued dynamic where the U.S. policy is not really galvanizing energy to resolve this issue diplomatically. That's the big fear, that we won't get a diplomatic resolution, and there will be very few options if North Korea continues to provoke.
Well, Mr. Rubin, of course, you're coming from the other political party. The criticism coming from you might be a commonplace these days toward the White House and the administration. However, I don't know whether what I'm going to say is going to cushion your comments or sharpen your comments in a way, because we are not seeing yet a well-known or well-understood Asia-Pacific strategy coming from this White House. Indo-Pacific, so-called. That was the White House used when President Trump was delivering his speech in Da Nang last year toward the Asia-Pacific. But we do not know necessarily this White House, what does it think about its approach to the Asia-Pacific region, in which there's a second largest economy like China, in which there are biggest allies like Japan and South Korea, in which there's also the hotspot, biggest crisis going on in the world, the Korean Peninsula issue. Mr. Rubin, would you help us to understand even a little bit about that?
Yes, and if I can add, I was a career State Department officer in the Bush administration and have worked deeply with both parties on national security issues. What's unique about this moment is the lack of clarity at the top in terms of what it is that the U.S. is trying to achieve. President Obama was very clear about Asia, the pivot, engaging in trade agreements. Now, there were critics on both sides, but he had a clear vision. Right now, we don't really know what President Trump's economic agenda is towards Asia. The security is focused on North Korea. But what about the partnerships in counterterrorism with countries in Indonesia? And of course, then there's the Philippines question, which has been very critically reviewed here in Washington by both parties, with the president engaging President Duterte, who's a human rights violator. So we have a real mixture of critical issues. Asia is the rising region in the world. The United States needs to be clear, and we haven't yet seen a clear vision of where the White House wants to take us.
But Mr. Rubin, if I could just add, do you think there could be any possibility that this White House is going to use the DPRK nuclear issue as the very top of the string for its Asia-Pacific policy? Because right now you see a lot of focus on this issue without other things being mentioned much. Do you think the White House will have this capability? Is this issue, can this issue be that one, be the top of the string?
Yes, well, the America First approach towards foreign policy is one where the United States is looking at these issues, like in North Korea, from a very American nationalist perspective. Defense spending increases are backing this up. So yes, I think that the prism for American policy towards Asia is going to be viewed through the North Korea issue. If that brings allies on board or pushes them away, that's to be seen. But there's not much more of an agenda after that in terms of regional engagements on economic issues, on issues related to social stability as well. And that's where it's a very distinct departure from the previous administrations, both Bush and Obama.
Mr. Huang, does it disturb you that the Trump White House is still yet does not have a sound strategy toward Asia-Pacific region, particularly to Asia, even northeastern part of Asia?
Well, first I want to address this idea of engaging and talking with North Korea. That's been done. That's been done over the past decade. And this is where we are, right? It follows the same old pattern, the same old script. And I think what Trump is trying to do right now is throw the military option as a real option onto the table, and to throw a level of uncertainty onto the table where it didn't exist. Because if you with the same script, with the same variables, we will get the same result over and over again. And that, I think, will be the worst outcome for America, because then America will lose any possibility of preventing North Korea having a missile with a nuclear warhead that can actually hit the mainland. So I think talking is not the solution here.
All right.
Actually having a solution is what they should be aiming for.
Mr. Rubin, I see you want to... Go ahead.
I beg to differ. That means that military action is the appropriate solution, and there is no military option that's viable to preventing a North Korean nuclear weapon, and without the cost being significant military action between the North and the South. So there has to be a diplomatic solution. Talking may not have been as effective as we want, so we need to find a different way to do it. But the idea that there's somehow going to be an American military operation in North Korea to just fix this, that was the kind of argument we used regarding Iraq about 15 years ago, and Americans have long memories about how that Iraq war was not worth the cost in terms of the objectives that we were told it would achieve. So we do need to find a diplomatic solution on this one.
All right. I suppose if you wouldn't agree with one another, we have another player coming in Medford in the United States, Sung-Yoon, Kim Kuk Korea Foundation professor with the Korea Studies at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Professor, welcome to our program through the phone. Professor Lee, your main idea about whether there is a strategy coming from the Trump White House toward the DPRK nuclear issue, and will this Olympic Games pose any possibility?
The Trump administration does have a policy which is primarily to enforce sanctions. Why? Because sanctions have never been uniformly enforced in any meaningful way. So that is the right approach. It is non-lethal, it is internationally justifiable, valid, and it will have some effect on the North Korean regime's means of generating revenue, primarily through illicit activities. At the same time, the manner in which the administration is trying to achieve this, announcing it, repeating their message that Pence is there to put maximum pressure. Pence is not going to allow North Korea to hijack the Olympics, that this is all a charade. All these things don't need to be said. Just silently do your job instead of coming across as the Grinch, as the grumpy, disgruntled party pooper. That is bad PR, and what North Korea is doing in terms of propaganda, Kim Jong-un sending his sister to South Korea and so on, this is playing the propaganda game at a higher level, higher than that of the United States. So the United States and Prime Minister Abe, rather than repeating all these messages, I think they should concentrate more in enforcing sanctions rather than saying that they will.
Professor Sung-Yoon, thank you so much for your input. Coming to you, Dr. Gao here in Beijing, what do you make of the fact that the White House right now do not yet, at least in public, have a overall approach toward the DPRK issue and also a strategy toward Asia Pacific? Today, when Vice President Pence visited Japan, it also has a trade issue. It says it has to be fair and balanced, and even though Japan and the United States have some issues because the United States wants to have America first, while Japan focus on so-called neutral trade.
Well, I would say, as I mentioned several times before, that the greatest uncertainty in the world today is coming out from the White House of the United States. And the greatest predictability is the unpredictability of the United States government headed by Mr. Donald Trump. And this is really a cause for great worries. And it also has a direct impact on the DPRK nuclear weapon program issue. At least for this round, I think DPRK comes out as a sheer winner because it has generated goodwill among the people in South Korea, and it has achieved to present itself in a very positive way at the Winter Olympics to be started very soon. And I think it's coming to the United States as to what exactly the U.S. can come up with, and we should not
and what the exactly U.S. wants.
Exactly, and I think we cannot afford to lose sight of our ultimate goal, that is the denuclearization of the DPRK nuclear weapon program. That's the ultimate goal we need to pursue.
We hope that is the ultimate goal for everybody.
Exactly.
We hope. Victor Gao, Huang Zhengyu, Sung-Yoon, and also, last but not least, Joel Rubin. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.